The cuff bit cold ceramite into my wrist, and the Arbites' helmeted shadow swallowed the doorway. Fluorescent tubes hissed overhead and turned the lock room into a small, honest world where every surface could be read and judged. My breath fogged in the light for a second, then the scanner took it. A quick, clinical sweep of iris and throat print, and I felt myself reduced to a string of numbers and a photograph on a cogitator screen. They led me past the magistratum placard, its gold leaf dulled by years of fingerprints. A clerk in a gray jacket tapped the placard with a stylus, as if proving it still meant something. His voice came out in clipped syllables, each one attuned to procedure. He said my name as if reciting a requisition number, and the syllables slid away from me. I heard them, but they did not settle. The cogitator ate the rest, my past addresses, the length of my work record, the names that had shown up in others' files. Lines of text bled into one another, and then collapsed into a single status. Detained. Evidence. The arrest itself had no flourish, no shouting, no dramatic accusations. An Arbites had pinned my arm with a hand like a vice, checked my hands, ensured I could not reach for anything, and that was it. Cold, methodical. That lack of theater made it worse. Theater at least pretended that reason or mercy might be in play. Here, everything intended to be efficient, to be recorded, to be repeatable. The clamps on my wrists left bright, aching impressions. The room smelled of disinfectant and machine oil. From somewhere behind a blind panel, a cogitator hummed like a beast settling to sleep. A different clerk, a woman whose spectacles flashed with readouts, ran her stylus down my file. Charges cataloged, she announced without looking up. Her words popped like seals being stamped. Public disturbance. Obstruction of a magistratum order. Association, 3 listed. She read the names, each one landed inside me with the distinct sensation of a blade finding a new mark. The Arbites recorded a risk level too, an assessment voiced in flat terms, low, medium, elevated, as though danger could be graded like humidity. They cataloged everything about me as if I were inventory. They photographed my face from 3 angles, each flash a small sun. They took prints, not just of my hands, but the ridges at the heel of my palm, the soft skin near my thumb. They took a sample of my hair. A narrow tube clicked as a clerk swabbed the inside of my cheek. In the corner, a sealed locker hummed things collected there were not of the body, but of the life. A battered data slate, a key ring with a single brass token, a scrap of printed paper with a hymn scribbled on it. Each item was cataloged, tagged with barcodes, and slid into cold storage. Until the process is finished, the Arbite said, voice flattened by helmet speakers, you are evidence, not person. Do you understand? The words landed with the same hard certainty as the cuff, was not a rhetorical question. The helmeted figure did not ask for my assent so much as inform me of my condition. Someone else might speak for me. Someone else might decide whether I would be allowed the right of counsel or the right of visitors. In that moment, the legal language of the Imperium showed its teeth. Rights were not natural. They were granted and rescinded with the same ease that a clerk crossed an entry off a ledger. The clerk pushed a thin slate toward me. It glowed faintly in the wash of fluorescent light. On it, the data laid out like a ledger, charges, potential penalties, suggested courses of action. I could feel the tentacle of bureaucracy curling around my life. There were options of a sort. One path promised expedience. Accept summary adjudication now. Answer for a smaller set of charges. Be assigned to a work detail or a short term of penance, and leave the lock room with the machinery of the magistratum marking me as compliant. The other path preserved some formalities. Contest the charges, request arraignment, retain a defender if I could find one, and risk being kept under evidence status indefinitely. Summary is quicker, the clerk said softly. Her voice suggested routine compassion. There was no warmth in it. Contest and you'll be transferred to remand. Evidence holds longer, higher scrutiny. Her fingers hovered over 2 boxes on the slate. For the first time in hours, my own pulse sounded like an accusation. I thought of my name, how it sat in the mouths of people who knew me, how it carried the weight of stories and debts and kindnesses. I thought of who might stand up for me. In the open world, a neighbor, a workmate, an old friend might speak. Here, past the placard and the scanners, those faces felt small and distant. A lawyer might be available, but lawyers cost coin and time. The magistratum's appointed advocates were a different thing. Efficient, practiced, likely to steer you toward options that closed cases where it suited the magistratum to close them. In the lockroom, counsel was not simply an abstract right, it was an economy. My certainty of who defended me was the first casualty of that economy. They read me my options like a prayer book. You may elect summary adjudication, the clerk intoned, tapping the first box. You may demand arraignment. Under the former, minor infractions may be settled with conditional release. Under the latter, procedural review applies. The Arbites stood behind her, a bulk of neutral steel and judgment, and a faint mechanical whir came from the helmet as the speaker modulated. If you elect arraignment, the Arbites added, you will be moved to remand. No privileges until counsel is secured. I tried to imagine each path as a doorway. The first door was narrow, a tunnel with a light at the far end. People came out of it later, eyes raw, voices different, holding their lives in their hands like thin glass. The second door was heavy and vast, iron-barred. It promised battles, motion, the chance that my name might be defended, but it also promised delay. If I chose the heavy door, I might be held as evidence for weeks. If I chose the narrow one, the magistratum's records would mark me as compliant, as someone who accepted an imposed judgment and moved on. A quiet joke rose in me and died. Compliance here meant a kind of survival. You accepted the state's narrative and were permitted a version of your life that could still be lived, if differently. Contesting meant you kept your name as an accusation. You kept your rights, fragile as they were, but you also invited the full glare of interrogation and perhaps an arbitrariness that could unmake you on a whim. The Arbit's helmet did not permit hesitation to be ornate. It leaned forward as if hungry for a decision. They asked my occupation, my associates' names, whether I had been to any protests, whether I frequented any forums. Each question felt like a small incision, precise and dehydrating. I answered what I could. I kept silent where I needed to. Silence became a sort of armor, but the clerks made it clear that silence had a price. A silence in the face of a charge might be read as evasion. A confession shortened procedure. There was, always, a cost. The cogitator chimed as it updated my file. A new strip of text slithered down the screen. Conditional release probable under summary adjudication. Beside it, a line in smaller type suggested higher scrutiny if arraigned. Possible escalation to inquisitorial interest. The words were simple, but their implication was enormous. An inquisitorial interest was the kind of phrase that could erase nuance and nuance's protectors. I felt my throat tighten. Sign here, the clerk said, pointing to the first box. Her finger was steady. Around us, the lockroom continued its indifferent business. Another detainee across the room coughed and was answered with a recorded list of instructions. A small camera followed the clerk as she moved. Everything was observed. Everything could be used. I looked at the pen she offered. It was ordinary, made of black resin. It left a faint smear on my finger when I wrapped my hand around it. I realized then how much the choice was not about guilt or innocence alone. It was about the kind of subject I wanted to be under the Imperium's machinery, someone who complied to keep their life intact in small ways, or someone who contested and tried to keep the truth of themselves unshaped by convenient verdicts. Neither path guaranteed dignity. "Do you need time?" the Arbites asked. The voice was emptier than before now that it had to negotiate. There was an almost imperceptible patience in it, like a steam valve easing open. Time here was not privacy. It was a chance to gather allies, to call a defender, to write down a story worth telling. Time also meant being labeled evidence longer. It meant that for as long as the cogitator maintained my file, I would be less than a person. My hand hovered above the slate. The pen warmed against my skin. In the corner, the brass token on my key ring caught the light and showed me a tiny familiar symbol I had almost forgotten. A child had once traced that mark with a sticky finger and laughed. That memory sat in my chest like an ember. The clerk watched my hand. "Choose," she said simply. Outside the lockroom, the corridor hummed. The magistratum placard gleamed faintly in the distance, as if to say that the world beyond still believed in order. Inside, the choice felt like an incision between what I remembered of myself and what the records would claim I was. My wrist throbbed where the ceramite cuff had left its mark. The Arbit's shadow leaned at the doorway. The cogitator awaited my answer as if it had been designed for that exact instant. I inhaled and rested the pen to the first box. The slate glowed beneath my hand. The weight of the decision was not moral alone. It was a measure of what I wanted to endure and what I wanted to keep. My finger tightened. I was about to write the kind of citizen I would be. He paced the questions like a scalpel, slow and measured. Who did you speak to between the market and the viaduct? What did you carry? What did you say to the man in the stained coat? Each answer came out small and brittle, an attempt to patch a memory that kept leaking. The lamp over the table threw one hard circle of light and left the rest of the room in a soft, accusing dark. I learned the shape of his jaw more than I learned his patience. When I said I'd been at the market, he repeated it as if the word could be rearranged into intent. He wanted not where I had been, but why. He wanted whether my palms had been empty, whether my fingers had brushed the hilt of something that could kill, whether I had muttered a slogan that might look like sedition on paper. He took the little facts and set them on his counter like coins, weighing them against each other until the tilt became an accusation. He put the ledger between us with a sound like a closing lid. It smelled of dust and oil and something older, like the smell of vaults where decisions were stored. Pages were stamped and crossed, names scratched out with a firmness that suggested someone else had already decided where guilt began. He flipped open to a section and tapped a smudge of handwriting with a knuckle. The ink looked like dried iron. "You said you were alone," he said, voice flat. "You said you left at dusk. You said you never raised your voice." I watched the shadow of his hand move over the page, watched the lamp steal the warmth from each word. My own words felt remote, like broadcasts from a different station. I wanted to be precise, to give him small, agreeable things. The less I said, the fewer doors he could pry open. But silence had its own gravity in a room like that. He read aloud, slow, and the page crackled in the space between his words. A complaint from a dockmaster about a scuffle near Cantor's Wharf 2 nights prior. A merchant's notation about a man with a scar who yelled for blood. A witness statement. A shout, then bodies on the pier, then a shape moving away with a stolen signal badge. Under those lines, in a hand no one signed, someone had scrawled, "Anonymous tip. Matches description of subject booked last night." I felt the room tilt. The words didn't need to be true to have weight. They only needed to be written. I was there, I said, because I had to answer something. The memory surfaced like a scrap of glass. The taste of ion smoke, the pressure of a crowd pushing like an organ, a voice close enough to burn. But there was no single image, only fragments, shadows sliding past one another, a flash of metal, someone falling with a sound like a box being closed. I could not fix the scene to a face. He leaned forward. The light picked up the scar along his knuckle, the white ridges like ledger entries on his skin. The tip says you were seen taking a signal badge, he said. Taken from a city guard during the scuffle. It says you wore it afterward. You were seen passing through Old Lupka with a man matching your description. They had a phrase for the moment when procedure became personal. It was the lean of the officer's shoulder, the way his questions narrowed from curiosity to pursuit. The ledger was no longer a record. It was a map with an X that led straight to me. You can pin a scrap of rumor on me, I said. I tasted metal in my mouth when I spoke, like I had bitten some small bitter coin. I don't even remember. You remember enough, he cut in. Enough to be dangerous, enough to have been seen. He pushed the ledger closer and opened another page. A different voice, clipped and efficient, had recorded a complaint from a woman who ran a soup stall near the viaduct. She had described a man who whispered to himself before he walked into the crowd. The ledger's margin note had the words, "possible agitator." It was an ordinary sentence made heavy by administration, a form filled out in the sterile language of control. You said you were muttering, he said. What did you say? I tried to place my own voice in the chaos. I remembered a fragment, 2 words, maybe overheard by someone else. Something about enough and no more. It could have been nothing. It could have been everything. My mouth kept finding excuses. Exhausted, drunk, a stray prayer swallowed by the roar. He let the silence sit. Outside, metal on metal, some distant tram or some other city noise, thudded in a rhythm like a heart. There was a smell now beneath the oil and paper, something like burnt cloth. He folded the ledger closed and tapped the cover with his nail, 3 rapid beats. We catalog complaints for a reason, he said. He didn't sound like a man who believed in reasons. A complaint plus a corroboration equals cause. Cause equals detention. Do you understand how this reads? You could hear the machinery behind the law. Lines of ink became gears, and the gears locked. It didn't matter whether I had taken a badge or only stood near where one had Arbites been taken. The ledger tied me to places, and places led to accusations. He stood up then, and the chair screeched like an animal. He went to a cabinet and returned with a small recorder. Its case was matte black, utilitarian. He placed it on the table like a relic. With efficient fingers, he set it between us, its little red light a tiny sun. We have a voice match, he said. Not perfect. Ambient noise. But enough. He pushed a button. A thin mechanical whir filled the room, and then a voice bled through, grainy, layered with the hiss of a crowd. My voice, or something that could be my voice, said a couple words. I flinched as if struck. The recording made the night a room I could not enter. Hearing my voice in that scrape of static was stranger than any mirror. It's one thing to claim you don't remember, it's another to hear a ghost of yourself confessing, softened by distance. He watched me then, really watched. It wasn't the directed stare of someone who seeks answers. It was the measured glare of someone who collects pieces until everything fits. An anonymous tip came with the detail, he said. He tapped the recorder again, as if to coax more out of the machine. A scrap of cloth with a burnt cog painted on it. Witness says she saw it tied to a man's sleeve as he moved through the crowd. That's how she marked him. She wrote cog on the stubbed report, the word pulled like a hook. There are tokens you can't forget. A brand, a piece of cloth, a smell. I felt an old burn memory in my palm, imaginary and precise. A smear of soot on a sleeve, a small circular stamp. For a second the world stilled and offered me a clear picture. My own sleeve cleaned of ash, but still faintly dark, a burned symbol I did not want to remember. That isn't mine, I said. At least not then. He held up his hand. We run that through reports, through tradesman logs. He spoke with a dry knowledge. It connects to a skirmish line at Cantor's Wharf. It connects to a lost signal badge the guards filed. It connects to your booking time. Coincidence is a poor defense when the ledger lines up. He used the ledger like a board. Each entry was a peg he could hang me on. The room felt smaller with every match he made. My words, once free, shrank to fit the holes he left for them. What if you got the cloth from someone else? I asked, trading in hypotheticals because it was safer. What ifs are not proof, he said, but they are motives. You see how it works? A motive stitched into a ledger looks like intention. He named possibilities, each one a legal shape I could step into without noticing. Accessory, possession, facilitation. The charges folded like a pamphlet in his hands and opened in my chest. He listed them not to confuse, but to let me know the range. He wasn't slinging thunderbolts, he was showing me the cage I might end up in. I thought of the man in the stained coat. Memory offered no face, only the angle of his shoulders, the way he cursed under his breath when he moved. I tried to place my hands during that moment. Did they clutch a rail? Did they fumble a pocket? My thumbs found the seam of my own trousers and worried it as if it were evidence. You haven't been charged yet, he said. That's on record. But grounds exist. We only need the magistrate to sign a hold for further questioning. It's administrative. Necessary. He said the last two words like a benediction. Necessary. They had a way of making guilt feel like an inevitability, like the weather. His authority was a soft pressure that spread through the room and into my joints. I wanted to argue, to tear pages out of the ledger and throw them into the light. I wanted to show him the blank spaces inside me, the absence of malice. Instead, I found my hands opening, slow and small. Maybe he saw the motion as consent. Maybe he saw it as a crack in a plan. You will be held while we pursue witnesses, he said. We'll bring them in. We'll run the cloth through identification. We'll pull traffic cams from Launch Lane and the viaduct. You will be on the record. You will make statements. You will not leave. There it was, a future imposed from the corner of a page. He did not need to tell me what the witness might say. The ledger had already filled in those blanks on its own. The anonymous tip would be called forward, and with it, the force that names shadows. I thought of my sister's hands, the way she tied the hem of my coat the same way every morning. I imagined the small, tight knot as evidence in a court that never knew her name. I imagined my voice, recorded and looped, becoming the heart of a charge. Do you have anything else to add? He asked. The question was polite, formal. The last space allowed for human noise before the machinery took over. I said nothing for a long time. The room filled with the sound of my breath and the tiny hiss of the recorder. Somewhere beyond the door, someone shifted, and the whisper of feet echoed down a hall like the start of orders being given. If I spoke, I could lie, or tell truth, or say less and oblige suspicion. If I stayed silent, they would call witnesses, and sets of facts would close around me like a hand. Either direction was a choice that meant movement. He watched the pause and did not prod. The ledger was closed now, its edges neat. The red light on the recorder blinked like a steady eye. He rose and made a note on a pad of his own. We'll bring witnesses at dawn, he said. If you remember anything, any name, any sign, any word at all, Tell us." His words were both an invitation and a warning. They pushed toward an action I could not yet see. I imagined the witnesses walking in, the scrap of cloth laid out on a table like a relic, hands pointing. I decided then that I would not let them fill every silence for me. If the ledger was going to plot my future, I needed a thread to pull before they did. I needed something small to show them that coincidence could be a mistake. I remembered one thing I said, and the sound of my own voice surprised me. It was small, almost ashamed to be used. A phrase. Someone said, "Hold the line." That's all. His pen stopped. The lamp hummed. The phrase was ordinary, but it was mine to offer when the room expected nothing. He looked at me like a man who had been given a key that might or might not fit the lock he already had. "Hold the line," he repeated. He wrote it down, slow. "We'll test that. We'll cross it with witness testimony. If it aligns, it will matter." He turned the ledger to close it for good, then hesitated. The hinge clicked, and for a moment everything was balanced on the edge of a future move. He slid the ledger back to the center of the table and pushed the recorder toward me. "You're here until the magistrate signs your hold," he said. "You'll be processed. You'll be watched. If you remember anything else, you'll speak up. If you don't, we will ask the witnesses to speak for you." He picked up the recorder and the lamp seemed to dim slightly as his hand moved in its shadow. The room had narrowed to the table, the ledger, and the path the next hours would take. Outside, the city continued. Trams, distant bells, the relentless commerce of a place that swallowed lives and made names into noise. He left the ledger open, the pen's line waiting, and walked toward the door. His steps were the kind that signaled a return. Behind him, the long hallway swallowed his silhouette. The lamp hummed, the red light blinked. I sat with the phrase inside me like a small stone pulled from a heap, and I knew I had to decide whether to throw it into the gears or hold it as a shield for the coming day. They shoved me into the cell before they turned the light off. The door's lock clicked like a verdict, and the light stayed on. Flat, clinical, too bright for night, too bright for sleep. The slab bed threw a long rectangle of shadow against the far wall. A small grill high above my head leaked a strip of corridor and a faint wash of footsteps. The air tasted of metal and old sweat, the kind of smell that holds grudges. I sat where they left me and felt the room rearrange itself around a single, unwelcome appliance. Silence. Silence in an Arbites holding cell is a thing that works on you. It doesn't soothe, it scours. Without the noise of the city to bury the details, every scrap of memory sharpened as if someone were running a fine file along my bones. The cadence of my neighbor's voice the day my daughter stopped eating, the way rain had sounded on the roof when I pretended to sleep and count the days until rent, the precise snap of the crate when it fell the night the goods disappeared. There was no one to argue with those recollections, no background clatter to dilute them. They rose up, articulated and unkind. I found myself cataloging things I hadn't noticed before. The seam of the blanket against my wrist, the faint oil stain on the slab where someone had once lain a belt, a nick in the floor tile that matched the one in my father's old house. Something that felt both mundane and intimate. A bridge, back to a life that could be smooth flat if you said the right things. Memory became a ledger, and every detail could be used against you or for you depending on how well you spoke. Sleep was dangerous, not just because of the lights. In that cell, closing your eyes meant surrendering your claim to time. An Arbites officer could make you forget whole stretches of your life by simply changing how events had been recorded. They could put signatures where mine had been, or ink a line through a name and make it disappear from the ledger. Sleep was a vulnerability you could not afford, so I stayed awake, drifting in small, guarded naps, feeling my jaw ache from clenching, letting my eyes burn while the world stayed thin and sharp. Hours passed in the small arithmetic of breath and heartbeat. The single speaker above the door clicked twice, then spoke in the same low, bureaucratic cadence he'd heard in the intake hall. Blunt, practiced. "Prisoner," the voice said, "prepare yourself." Footsteps down the corridor. One set, then another. Keys. The door opened with that cold legal smell of oil and metal. 2 Arbites officers entered. The first wore the plain black overcoat of the precinct. The second had the pale, impassive mask that meant seniority more than anything else. He carried a folio under his arm, the edges crisp, stamped with an emblem that suggested finality. Light fell differently across them. Where the younger officer's shadow trembled, the senior's did not. He stood with the folio visible, like a book laid open on the table. He did not smile. "You understand why you're here," he said. The voice was not cruel. It didn't need to be. The cadence made the same movement as a guillotine. I nodded because it felt like a motion that could be observed. He didn't ask me to speak at first. He watched me as if he were taking notes from my face. "We have a straightforward proposition," he continued. "Confess in full to the charges we have listed. Sign the transcript. Provide a statement acknowledging your role. In exchange, we reclassify your case, mitigated culpability. Your family will be placed under protective measures and afforded certain allowances pending the court's discretion. You will avoid extended reassignment to penal work camps. You will keep your life." Words arranged themselves like a map I had no permission to read. Protect the family. Keep the life. Speak the convenient truth, and it would be stamped into the records, become a thing the city could trust and rely on. The folio was a template for that convenience, a neat narrative with a door left open, small privileges, a managed shame. He unfolded the folio. "Refusal," he said simply, "escalates your classification. We move you into a higher security tier. Your file will be flagged with an elevated risk marker. We will widen our inquiry into associates. Your family will be interviewed, and their status will be adjusted on the basis of your non-compliance. Their allowances will be suspended pending full investigation. You will be escorted to a facility better equipped to extract complex denials." He used the word extract without irony, and I understood the architecture he implied. Escalation was not just a harsher room or colder meals. Escalation meant files rendered unreadable to the casual observer, paperwork moved into sealed stacks, opportunities for legal recourse narrowed to the width of a bone. It was a bureaucratic erasure that could be just as absolute as any harsher punishment. I thought of my daughter's small hands, the way she had tucked her thumb into the seam of her sleeve when she was tired. I thought of my wife, the way she slept with one hand on the cupboard door, always expecting that something would be taken. The offer on the table smelled like an anesthetic. Dull the pain in exchange for the truth you did not want to tell. I felt the practical muscle of my life reach for the deal, as a drowning man reaches for a buoy. "You are aware this is not an apology," the senior officer said. "It is a statement of responsibility. The tribunal will record it as such. The record is a powerful thing. The record answers future questions before they are asked." He slid a page forward. The confession was already written in the clipped, numb prose of procedures. It placed me at the center of events with convenient moral contours, enough guilt to be believable, enough contrition to be redemptive, no suggestion of deeper conspiracy or higher culpability. It punished me in a way the city could accept and offered my family a precisely measured softening. The younger officer watched me with the flat patience of someone who'd seen too many such bargains. "You sign," he said. "You get to stay with them. You don't sign, you make them collateral. No rhetoric, No threats, just the arithmetic of a system that preferred tidy outcomes. But the arithmetic had edges that cut. To sign would be to shape the past, to save the present. To refuse would be to keep the truth intact, whatever that truth was, and hand the system a problem it did not like to leave unsolved. I remembered a face in a crowd the night the shipment vanished, blurred, then suddenly sharp when a lantern swung past. I remembered the click of a boot on the crate as it was lifted. I remembered not shouting then, because silence has its own forms of protection. I remembered lying in bed afterwards and counting the hours until the market closed so I could go look for the missing goods. Memory was a messy thing. The confession promised to tidy it, to put all those tangled threads into a neat coil and hand it back to the authorities. It made me complicit in making a story that would fit on a line. What will they do to me if I refuse? I asked. The question surprised me with how small it sounded in the cavernous cell. The senior officer smiled, as if he had been asked to explain gravity. You will be reclassified as a higher risk. That changes the forms we route your case through. It changes who is allowed access to your file. It alters the default disposition of your assets and the application of sanctions to your dependents. In practical terms, it means you are less visible to those who might help and more visible to those who can decide your fate without an appeal. It was a bureaucratic cruelty rendered in administrative language. The consequence sounded abstract until I pictured my daughter's face at an empty table and felt it fold inward. Do you want us to read it to you? The younger officer asked. He had the kind of voice that seemed intended to be reassuring, but instead reminded you that even mercy had a protocol. I wanted to ask whether the protective measures were real, whether my family would actually be safe, whether the allowances would be more than a month's cotton. I wanted to ask whether a signed line would truly keep them from being questioned or relocated or erased by procedure. I wanted guarantees, and the Arbites offered guarantees only in the form of ink and signatures. I listened as they described the logistics, a transfer to supervised housing, ration supplements, an expedited tribunal date. Everything had an envelope, a stamped expectation. The trade was simple on paper, a ledger balanced by official hands. But in my chest, there was a constant reckonings, things the folio couldn't account for. The way the city would whisper, the look the neighbors would give my wife when they saw the line on my record, the suspicion that grows like mold in the absence of light. At the same time, I thought of how the institution had already begun to rearrange things without me. My name had been cataloged into categories I had not chosen. The initial arrest fingerprints had been copied into databases, cross-checked. I had watched, powerless, as the system smeared me out into its ledger until there was no small detail left that wasn't accounted for. The offer felt less like mercy than a choice of how I would be written. Sign this, he said finally, and pushed a pen across the slab. The pen had a weight to it, a dull authority. The ink smelled faintly of antiseptic and power. The folio waited like an open wound that could be closed with a single decisive motion. I imagined the moment I would hold that pen in my hand, the slight tremor it would take on as I considered the syllables of the statement. I imagined the way my circle would tighten or snap once the ink dried. I imagined the ledger entry, the family allowances, the way my daughter's lunch would be bought again because a line on a page said it should be. The younger officer's eyes flicked to the door, then back to me. He had the patience of someone used to watching people decide whether to save themselves at the expense of their stories. We do not demand falsehood, he said. We require a version the tribunal will accept. It was a soft threat wrapped in a softer lie. They would accept a version that fit the city's appetite for simple guilt. The rest would be edited out. I could feel myself negotiating with an image of myself who would be smaller, more useful, easier to pardon. I put my hand on the pen. The metal was cool. My knuckles were raw from holding breath. Outside the cell, the corridor hummed with the sound of the city that did not know how thin the thread of me was. Inside, the folio waited, the words already pressed into the future. I thought of resistance, not a heroic, loud defiance, but the stubborn refusal to let someone else tidy my past. I thought of the slowly widening ring of consequences that refusal would call down, a bureaucratic ripple that would reach into my wife's file, into my daughter's lunch ration. I weighed the shape of survival against the shape of truth until the balance tipped and the room felt like the inside of a scale. "Decide," the senior officer said quietly. The word had no hurry in it, only a steady, inexorable push. My hand moved slightly over the pen. The air tasted of ink and the last of my certainty. I was not a man who had expected to be offered a choice that rearranged the axis of his life in a single stroke. The offer was simple on paper and corrosive in practice. It promised shelter at the cost of a story, or the keeping of a story, at the likely cost of being rewritten by the system, in ways that would be unrecognizable to anyone who loved me. I closed my fingers around the pen and felt the faint vibration of the corridor through the metal. The folio's pages trembled, patient and awaiting. The officers watched without expression. The silence leaned in, a thing that wanted to be filled with ink and agreement. My heart beat in that silence like a mallet on a bell. I had a choice to make: bend the truth to save them, or hold to whatever truth I still possessed and watch the system reshape everything I had left. My thumb found the edge of the page, and for a long moment I only listened. To my daughter's breathing in my memory, to my wife's small, unconvinced laugh, to the distant life beyond the slab and the light. Then I began to write, if only to see whether my hand would tremble with guilt or with relief. The light over the table cut me into a kind of honesty the city had never asked for and never granted. It was hard, surgical, the kind of light that made skin look like ledger paper and shadows like secrets waiting to be billed. My hands were on the table. The metal was warm from other palms. Across from me, a man in Arbites gray did not lean. He let the silence do the leaning for him. He had a file that rested like a threat. He had a pen that waited like a promise. "Sign," he said. It was business, not mercy. The word landed in my chest like a verdict and stayed there. Sign, and the machine would rewrite me. Refuse, and they would move me where the noise was constant and the rules were invisible. Either way, the institution would extract price and make sure I paid it according to ledger and law. I had seen the apparatus in the corner before. It hovered like an altar, all cables and mirrored panels, its hum a low, obedient purr. They called it many things depending on who pocketed the favor that day. To the registrar, it was a diagnostic instrument that settled disputes. To the warder who had walked me past it, it had been a convenience, a way to clean up unruly testimony without more paperwork or public spectacle. To me, it looked like a small factory, a machine that took a story, squeezed it until corners were neat, and returned a confession that fit the city's shape. It didn't strike. It did not need to. It translated. If I signed, the machine would not simply change the facts. It would change how people remembered the facts. Witnesses would be coaxed into slots that matched my new handwriting in the record. A neighbor who had frowned at me in the street would be shown a ledger entry and then politely encouraged to remember differently. The warders would ask leading questions in quiet corridors and hand them tissues when the story turned inconvenient. Reports would be written to read like confession, not coercion. Official registries would consume the ink, and from then on, everything that mattered would be keyed to that neat, stamped admission. The city would sleep easier. My name, in the municipal mouth, would belong to a version of me that apologized and remained silent. I thought of the first time I had raised my voice in that district. Not about theory or virtue, but about a smell of smoke that had lingered for months, about a ration clerk who pocketed coins, about a light that no one could fix. A few words had become a list, and the list had become a problem. That problem had become a person. Now a single motion of a wrist could be the eraser and the signature both. They promised life. They promised immediate release into streets that did not remember what I had done to make them safer. They promised sunlight and the ability to keep breathing without shackles for a while. In return, I would give up the right to say the city was wrong. My credibility would be a currency spent once and never reissued. The pen was ordinary enough, a cheap metal thing with a seal scratched on its barrel. When the warder held it out, its weight in my hand felt like the first time I had been taught to count numbers meant decisions then too. If I signed, no magistrate would need to sift truth from fiction. If I signed, my future protests would be footnotes in a file that said I had already confessed. They would hand my words back to me, pale and impotent, quoted in an official redaction whenever I tried to speak. "Refuse," the man in gray said, "and we move you deeper." He did not make the threat theatrical. He did not need to. They would not call the next place a prison. They called it continued detention, observation, administrative custody. The cell doors were quieter there, the lights timed to fracture sleep. The watchers learned to listen in silences. They were patient because they had time, and because the law lent them that patience. It is an old thing. When people have the luxury, they watch for minutia. A frown when a schedule was called, a whispered word to a neighbor, a second too slow to fetch a tray. They trained themselves to notice moral clarity as if it were a crime a person who refused could be read by those who wanted them gone as someone who might one day act. That interpretation, given and repeated enough, became an instrument. I had watched them before when they coaxed a witness. They did it with small, almost tender violence. A woman who had seen me argue with an overseer was taken aside like a patient and offered tea and a story that made it easier for her to turn away. They showed her where signing a statement would spare her a summons. They reminded her, gently, that the city had habits, and that habits were self-preserving. She signed. Later, she passed me in the corridor and did not look. Her face had the polite blankness of people who'd been asked to forget without meaning to. The alternative to signing was not heroism. In the Arbites system, moral clarity was a vulnerability because it left you vulnerable to narratives woven after you refused. An official could put a bent ledger entry on a watch list. A petty guard could invent an incident. Cameras, always there, could be told to check the recording and find perfectly timed shadows. The law was less a blind goddess than a patient sculptor. It took raw people and chiseled them into acceptable shapes. Refusal made you a raw edge they thought might snag at the cloth of order. They liked to show you what that snag would cost. I imagined them cataloging me, a file filled with refusals, with incidents they could parade into guilt. A watch attached to my name, a mental index of every time I had looked twice at a patrol route. Each item, however minor, could become the cornerstone of a case for permanent removal. Permanent removal rarely needed a single crime. It needed a story, and stories can be assembled like brickwork. They would make the story of me a slow demolition, each incident a mortar joint, until there was no foundation left to stand on. There was cunning in that patience. It did not seek applause. It sought erosion. I understood with a cold clarity that signing was not merely admission, it was the transfer of narrative authority. To sign would be to hand them a script and then step off the stage in good standing. To refuse would be to refuse the first chapter and then be watched while the Arbites wrote the rest for you, their pens dipped in inevitability. The choice felt less like a trap than like two different kinds of death. One public and quick, the other private and procedural. The warder slid the file toward me, the edge rattling across the metal like a small insult. He did not speak again. His eyes were trained to be unreadable, like tribunal glass. A camera in the ceiling clicked, as if on cue its red eye was patient. The registrar at the machine in the corner made an idle adjustment, as if tuning something that had no direct relation to me. Small noises, all of them. A city that had learned its own language of coercion uses the quiet to intone rules you cannot protest. My mouth was dry. I tasted metal and the ghost of stale bread. The file smelled faintly of tobacco and disinfectant. There were two forms inside, one for admission and mitigation, and one for continued custody. The choice required a signature on one and a quiet acceptance of being cataloged into the other. Both forms had bureaucratic efficiency, both promised an end to this room, both demanded a price. I had friends who had signed just to breathe again. I had seen others refuse and become exemplary cases in the Arbites' slow seminar of removal. I thought of the people who would listen if I spoke, a crowd in a market, a neighbor, a clerk who nodded as if to map his own safety. Would they believe me if the ledger already told them I had confessed? The machine would give them a neat story. It would give them absolution and a comfortable ending. There was also the question that no authority asked aloud. How many times could one be forced to pay for a single mistake before the city's account was balanced? The Arbites had taught me the answer. Indifference to the number does not require cruelty, it requires systems. I put my hand over the pen. It sat warm under my fingers. The metal on the table hummed like an insect that had learned to speak. My pulse was a small, steady drum in my throat. Outside the room, through the thick walls, life continued with the odd cruelty of things that believe they are permanent. A bell, perhaps the distant cackle of a market hawker, the soft bass of tram engines. The warder watched my hand, as if it contained some answer he had not yet authorized. There is a peculiar clarity in the moment before a choice. The universe contracts to the hinge of a wrist. You can count the ways a city will shape you if you let it. You can see the ledger already closed, or notice the spaces that remain to be written upon. I thought then of what it meant to maintain moral clarity in a place built to erase it, and how that clarity could be used like a brand against you. I thought of a public life that would be quiet, but intact if I signed. I also thought, stubbornly, of the truth as I remembered it. Messy, stubborn, and resistant to neat margins. My thumb tightened around the pen. The warder's fingers brushed my forearm, palpating for a tremor that might mean confession or conviction. He did not say, "Decide." He did not need to. The door at the far end of the chamber opened a fraction, and a different smell came through. Colder air, bleach, the promise of more waiting. The registrar's machine clicked, as if in patient countersignature. I slid my hand forward, then stilled. The decision hovered like a bell ready to be struck. Before I could choose, a second officer stepped into the doorway. A quiet, efficient shadow who carried a small board with names on it. He looked at me, then at the man in gray, then back at me. His eyes were not unkind. They were, instead, the practiced eyes of people who knew their cities. Truths needed neither cruelty nor compassion to be effective. He tapped the board with a nail and said, without leaning toward either mercy or menace, "Time." The guard's hand closed on my arm to lead me one way or the other, and the pen lay between us, patient and indifferent. I had until the metal left my skin to choose. The light seemed to sharpen. The machine in the corner hummed, like somebody waiting for the last syllable of a sentence. My mouth opened. I had a decision left to make. The lamp over the booking table buzzed in a clean, small way, like a fly caught between two panes of glass. I had held worse lights than that, Sunless, surgical lamps that made your skin look false and thin. But this one had the same honesty. It showed everything it touched, and it showed me the paper in my hand. Small, official, stamped with the seal that did not need words to explain itself. I folded it twice, then once more, not because folding would change the words, but because the motion steadied my fingers. The corridor smelled of disinfectant and boiled metal. 2 Arbites stood farther down, talking in short sentences that carried no warmth. They watched the door I had just left and then watched me, the way men watch embers. After a fire, they did not wait for the flames to die. A woman in a thick cloak moved past, clutching a child to her chest. She glanced at me as if trying to read the paper through my coat. Her eyes slid away before they found the seal. Outside the hall, the city sounded like a thing half asleep, half alert. The trams went by with a shudder, boots clicked, someone tuned a radio to something that was 2 parts sermon and 1 part blessing. A street vendor shouted about hot gruel. The world carried on owning its hours, indifferent to the paperwork inside its joints. I kept my hand in my pocket and felt the paper's thin edge, a cold line against my palm. The Arbites paperwork was a kind of grammar. It told you what you were allowed to be and what the city would let you keep. Mine read, confession accepted. Charges commuted on account of cooperation. Conditions applied. It said it without the flourish of mercy. The stamp said it with the authority that could close doors and open other, smaller ones. I had signed where they asked me to, not trusting the scribble to mean anything noble. Signing had the inevitability of a hinge. You either closed the door or left it ajar. The first man I saw after the gate had been released the day before. He walked like someone who had been measured for chains and found no right fit. He kept his head low. A neighbor I knew in passing folded his arms when I passed, the wrong side of familiarity. He held the look that says, nothing is the same, ever again, even if you are standing 2 houses from where you slept last. That is one way the Arbites teach, not through simple threat, but by reshaping how people look at you on the A street. Another face I remembered came from inside the hall, a young woman who had refused to sign for anything. They had stripped her of public office quietly that evening. She had been a small council clerk, a position that fed a family and dressed a child. They did not parade her away. There were no shackles. A note was made in a ledger, and the next morning, her name simply did not appear where names had to appear. That was the other way the law punished. The cages were sometimes made of paper and habit rather than iron. She walked out with her head high and her purse empty. Her integrity had teeth, it ate her future. A third man, an old worker from the foundry, laughed when they read him his options. He chose exile over apology. The Arbites let him go because the city had nowhere left to hold him that would keep him softer than the streets. He left with a thin grin and a cane that had been a ring of sweat and resentment for 40 years. He might survive, but he would survive differently, on corners and by deeds, rather than in a home with a key that belonged to him. These were the small law cases of a large world: exoneration, confession, silence. Each was a different wound. Each left its pulse. The Arbites were not simply the hands that enforced. They were the surgeons of daily existence, taking what they deemed necessary and sewing the rest back together in a different pattern. They calibrated shame and relief until the citizen learned the math of living in the city. When I stepped into the market, someone called my name as if it were already rumor. Conversations folded like maps when you approach a neighbor pretended to be interested in vats of oil while his eyes counted the lines stamped on my cuffs. Lines that were not meant to be visible, but somehow always were. The paper in my pocket grew heavier with every look. It was a weight I could not carry without changing my gait. At home, the air was humid with stew and the ghost of old arguments. The flat smelled like two lives layered together, the scent of someone who laughs too loudly, and the thin dryness of someone who gives apologies like coins. My landlord used to knock soft. Now he knocked in measured beats, as if counting. He asked no questions about the hall. He did not have to. The seal on the paper told him more than any conversation could. He left a bill under the door a day early after I returned. The Arbites had put conditions beside my name in the registry. Minor curfews at odd hours, mandatory reporting to a precinct 2 blocks farther than would be convenient, a microchip registered to my ID that would sing quietly if I left the sanctioned zones without consent. None of it was theatrical. None of it required spectacle to be effective. You learn to navigate the city like a needle moves through fabric, carefully, in small stitches. There is a particular sound that comes with losing trust. I heard it in the silence of the kitchen when the radio played white noise between programs. It was the sound of chairs being considered and left standing. I tasted it in the stew. I felt it in the way children stopped running across the courtyard and instead moved in lines so as not to attract attention. The city rewired itself around the decisions you had made or were made for you. That perhaps was the cruelest lesson the Arbites offered. Consequences outlive reputations, but they also outlast memories. People asked me, sometimes without words, why I had chosen confession. They assumed mathematics, where there was only hunger and heat and cold decisions. They assumed I had weighed pride against survival on a scale balanced by other people's desperation and chose the lighter option. But decisions are not always clean weights. They are sometimes the last warm thing you can grab in a storm. I had my reasons that would not sound like reasons in the mouths of those who had not slept under watchful roofs. I had family to consider, mouths that needed bread. I had debts that would not wait for the slow justice of better times. After the first week, the city stopped staring so hard. People wore me like a coat with a stain, visible but not constantly remarked upon. That was another mercy, habituation. The world has the efficient cruelty of forgetting. It files events until they are footnotes, then stapled memories. But the ledger remembered. The registry kept a slow, honest record of my name, the date, the seal. Official things do not forget the way people do. They are slow-acting salts, preserving things long after the flesh has softened. I went back to the precinct once, 2 months later, on the pretext of clearing a scheduling issue with my reporting day. The Arbite sergeant recognized me by the way I moved, careful, resigned, with a hand that returned too often to a pocket. He watched me sign the register and did not ask about the paper I had folded within it. He did, however, hand me a small card that listed idling restrictions and a panel where I could mark my place of work to avoid being pulled aside for secondary checks. He slid it across the table as if sliding a coin can settle a life. The gesture had kindness in it and cruelty both. It was the same coin that had bought my quiet. On the street later, a boy spilled a tray of cups, and I helped him gather them. My hands were clumsy, used to the sharp edges of new rules. He looked up at me with the stunned recognition of those who witness small kindnesses from people the city has marked. For a moment, his face was a map I could read. It told me that consequences are not simply punitive, they instruct the young on what caution looks like. I thought of the young woman who had refused to sign, of the old worker who chose exile, of the neighbor who had folded his arms against me. There are more ways to be confined than with bolts and bars. The confession taught me another thing too. Power is not only taken, it is traded. You trade your voice for a roof, your name for a day you can count, on the market opening. The Arbites taught the city to barter its citizens into shapes that are useful. They maintained stability by making sure people knew the cost of optional defiance. A person who tried to fight the system would find themselves atomized, not by spectacle, but by quiet erasures. The law can be a sieve. It lets small freedoms through and holds back others until there is nothing left to resist with. I kept the paper for a while, folded in three, and then folded again. It felt less like a verdict and more like a tool. It could be a shield against something worse, a bargaining chip if I had to save someone else. I imagined scenarios where its stamp might be enough to get a sick neighbor medical attention without inquiry, or to persuade a foreman to give work to someone who needed it, despite their record. Each imagined use made me feel less like a casualty and more like a participant. That was dangerous thinking, because it turned consequence into currency. Then, one night, when rain hammered the roofs like a fist on drumheads, I took the paper out and looked at the seal in the rainlight. It blurred the ink into small rivers. I thought of the city ledger that would keep a clean, dry copy forever. I thought of the woman whose job was gone, the old worker's grin, the neighbor's measured knock. I folded the paper twice more and, instead of putting it back in my pocket, I left it on the windowsill where the rain could finish the job the city had started. I did not burn it. I did not throw it away like a thing of no consequence. I left it to be washed, to lose the crisp edge that made its words absolute. In the morning it would be a soggy scrap, legible enough for the registry, but less useful as leverage. Perhaps that was cowardice. Perhaps that was strategy. I could not tell which. The next hour I left the flat because the rain made everything smell like clean stone, and because staying inside with the papers and the past felt worse than walking into the wet unknown. I walked with the deliberate slowness of someone learning to obey new curfews in their bones. I had an appointment to keep, nothing official, nothing the Arbites would stamp. A friend of a friend required help moving a machine across a warehouse floor. It was small work, dangerous for the hands if nothing else, and it paid in food and something more useful. Names that still mattered. People who would look you in the eye and measure you by the help you give rather than the stamp you bear. As I crossed the market, someone called my name, not with gossip, but with necessity. A cart had tipped a child's foot had been trapped beneath a wheel. 10 hands moved without asking for credentials. We lifted the cart together. The child cried and then stopped, because strangers' hands are sometimes better than medicine. No Arbites stood in the circle. There was no ledger to record what had just happened. There was only the motion of bodies making space. The paper in the window would be sodden by dawn, and the registry would still keep its record. The city remembered. I had learned that. But memory is not only what a sealed stamp preserves, it is also what people carry of your deeds. I moved toward the warehouse with my shoulders set and my palms open, willing to trade what I had left for something that might not fit into any ledger. I did not know whether that trade would buy me back the thing I had conceded or create something entirely new. I only knew it would be a choice I would make in the open, not the kind the hall had offered me in a quiet room under a lamp.